In 1921, the world was still reeling from the devastation of the First World War. Eastern Europe was in shambles, much of the world was in a depression, and a newly budding arms race at sea threatened to plunge the world back into war. America had come to the Allies' rescue to help end the war, and now they would step up again to prevent another. And President Harding's target was the naval buildup. But you can play out your own naval arms race with this video's sponsor, World of Warships. World of Warships is a free-to-play game available on PC, where you can take command of warships from World Wars I and II and engage in naval battle, allowing you to play real historical ships in combat scenarios they never got to experience. World of Warships allows you to take command of many of the ships that the Washington Naval Conference was trying to control, such as the Japanese destroyer Fubuki, or the British cruiser HMS Exeter, or the American battleship the USS Florida. The game can also function like a digital museum, displaying these breathtaking recreations of the most fearsome ships of the 20th century, but they also include the ships that were planned but never built, giving you an amazing range of gameplay possibilities. And they are releasing new content every month in the form of new ships, cosmetics, and nations. It has over 40 unique maps with dynamic weather and some brilliant new water effects. You'll have access to battleships, destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and aircraft carriers that let you command both the tides and the skies. And if you get really into the game, they have an active community with a dedicated Discord server, live streams, and tournaments. And if you're not a PC person, that's fine, because the game is also available on Xbox and PlayStation. And as I said earlier, this game is free to play, and you can do so by clicking the top link down in the description below. And if you use the promo code WARSHIPS, you can get a bunch of free goodies such as Doubloons, premium account time, and a free battleship after 15 games. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video, but for now, back to the history. Although the United States had participated in the Versailles negotiations, the US Senate did not approve the treaty, leaving the Harding administration to make separate treaties with all of the belligerent powers. The war had been expensive and resulted in a huge accumulation of power to the executive branch that President Harding wanted to walk back. In November of 1922, Harding invited 8 governments to send delegations to Washington, D.C. to hammer out an agreement on naval armaments, with a particular emphasis on the Pacific. The invited countries were France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal, Britain, China, and most importantly, Japan. Japan's growing strength in the Western Pacific had been a concern for American policymakers since the McKinley administration. President Roosevelt had even sent the Great White Fleet on a world tour as a means of deterring Japanese aggression, which worked for a time. But World War I gave Japan an excuse to exercise its military prowess, capturing all of Germany's holdings in the Pacific north of the equator, and then invading and occupying the Russian Far East during the Allied intervention, which it was still occupying. Japan had also been eyeing American possessions in the Pacific, such as Guam and the Philippines. The primary aim of the American delegation, led by Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes, was to restrain Japan's naval expansion as well as getting Japan to support the continued open-door policy in China. The primary goal of the British was to achieve stability in the Western Pacific. Possessing the largest colonial empire meant that Britain had the most to lose in a naval arms race, with so many territories to protect. They needed an agreement that allowed them to maintain a navy just large enough to police its empire and protect its trade routes while ensuring its potential rivals, America and Japan, couldn't overpower them. Additionally, there was the Anglo-Japanese Treaty, in place since 1902, which maintained peace between the two and prevented either of them from getting ganged up on in the Pacific. This treaty had allowed Japan to assert its claims in Korea by preventing Russia and the other colonial powers of Europe from ganging up on them like they had in the First Sino-Japanese War. But the recent war altered the global balance of power, which made London see the United States as the bigger potential threat in the Pacific. So a treaty that would restrain both Japan and America was ideal, especially since the Anglo-Japanese Treaty was set to expire in 1922. The Japanese delegation, led by Prince Iesato Tokugawa and Minister of the Navy Baron Kaito, had 2 main goals: to sign a naval treaty with Britain and the US, and to obtain official recognition of its interests in Manchuria and Mongolia. They also wanted to retain control of Tsingtao in China, as well as Siberia. The Washington Naval Conference was one of the first instances of the US using espionage to give them the upper hand in negotiations. The US government was able to intercept and decrypt messages from Tokyo to their embassy in DC, which revealed the lowest possible ratio the Japanese government was willing to accept in an arms limitations treaty. There are numerous ways in which you could craft an arms limitation treaty, but the main ways considered are by weight or by number. The conference would come to a weight-based standard, placing a ceiling on the total tonnage of steel for a navy. The US and Britain, with territorial commitments in multiple oceans, were each given 525,000 tons, while the Japanese, only needing to patrol one ocean, were given a limit of 315,000, a ratio of 553. France and Italy were also there, though most histories of the conference ignore them, were given an even smaller ratio of 1.67. In addition to total tonnage, the conference also set limitations on the size and weight of battleships, still seen as the primary instrument of naval warfare. They agreed that battleships could be no larger than 35,000 tons, and they also placed a cap on how many total tons of their navies could consist of battleships, with the US and Britain being allotted 135,000 tons each, and Japan being allotted 81,000 tons. The conference is usually portrayed as just one overarching treaty, but in reality it was a collection of smaller treaties dealing with various issues of politics, economics, and warfare. But one area of particular interest to Japan was that of territorial claims. The Allied intervention into Russia during its civil war was a confused clusterfuck, but nobody took greater advantage of that clusterfuck than Japan, who occupied much of eastern Russia, and even after the other allies had pulled out in 1920, Japan was still there in the winter of 1922. The Europeans and Americans didn't like this precedent of an upstart power, especially a non-white country, just occupying large portions of their home territory during a time of internal political instability. They made their disapproval of the occupation very clear, which forced the Japanese delegation into a diplomatic ultimatum. Hold on to the territory and guarantee access to raw materials, but become politically and economically isolated from the rest of the world, or return control of the territory to Russia and maintain good relations with the Western powers. At this time, Japan was under the rule of the Taisho Emperor, which in Japanese history is referred to as the Taisho era, which is noted for being the most democratic period of Japanese history before their surrender in World War II. It was a time when elected officials were more concerned with public opinion and good relations with outsiders than they would be for another generation. And so, after communicating with their government in Tokyo, they agreed to withdraw from both Siberia and the Shandong Peninsula in China. Although each country's respective navies disliked them, the Washington treaties were, on the whole, very popular. After years of war, it felt like peace could actually be maintained if militaries were deprived of the means of fighting each other. There were other criticisms of the treaty aside from those coming from their respective navies. The fact that only 9 countries were a part of the negotiations was seen as an oversight by some. The fact that the entirety of Latin America, especially Chile, who had the largest coastline facing the Pacific of any country in the region, was excluded was odd. The other major omissions were Germany and Russia. But Germany was excluded because its navy had already been drastically reduced thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, and in 1922 the US, who was hosting the conference, didn't recognize the Soviet Union, and thus wouldn't have allowed them to attend even if they were a major naval power, and in 1922 they definitely weren't. But the Washington treaties would not be the end of interwar arms limitation agreements. However, none of the succeeding ones would be as successful as the first. In 1927, another conference was held in Geneva. Calvin Coolidge called for a meeting of the Big Five powers, addressing the arms race that had developed due to oversights in the previous treaty. The US wanted to extend the ratios applied to capital ships to smaller vessels as well. The Washington treaties had placed a limit of 10,000 tons on cruisers that carried 8-inch guns, but this ended up functioning as a minimum ship size rather than a max. At this time, the US was planning on building 25 heavy cruisers that were 10,000 tons each. The UK was willing to accept parity with the US when it came to cruiser fleets, so long as the number was large enough for them to patrol their empire. To achieve this, the British delegation proposed reducing the size of cruisers to 8,000 tons each, which would make building a large number of them easier. Japan's goal for the conference was to increase its share in the ratio from 553 to 10-10-7. This was desired because Japan's military planners believed that their navy would need to be at least 70% of the size of the US or British navies in order to win a war in the Pacific. The conference would end without an agreement because the US and UK couldn't agree on a size limit for cruisers. Another conference was called in 1930 to meet in London. This time they wanted to address the growing concerns of submarines, deciding to limit their size to 2,000 tons each. Each country would be allowed to keep up to 3 submarines that were up to 2,800 tons, except for France, who was only allowed 1. They would also agree to restrict the size of guns on submarines to 203mm, which killed a burgeoning class of super submarines. The London Treaty managed to succeed where they had failed at Geneva, and finally established limitations on cruisers. They would create distinctions between light cruisers and heavy cruisers, and instead of being given a tonnage, they were given a hard limit on the total number of heavy cruisers they could have, while light cruisers would have tonnage-based limits. They also tackled destroyers, limiting their size to 1,850 tons and 130mm guns, and limiting their numbers by the 5-5-3 tonnage ratios. The treaty also declared that submarines and surface vessels were subject to international law, but it also gave the signatories permission to sink merchant vessels without escorting their crews or passengers to safety if they refused to stop. The treaty would also completely exempt ships that were under 600 tons from the stipulations of the Washington Treaty. This led to another arms race, but with much smaller ships. Another arms limitation treaty was attempted in Geneva between 1932 and 1934, but it was a complete failure. And this conference wasn't limited to just navies, but armies and air power as well, with the US, USSR, and Germany all participating. The American delegation delivered a proposal drafted by President Hoover, one that was considered extremely radical for the time and, quite frankly, would still be radical today. Hoover proposed a total ban on all military aircraft, submarines, tanks, and poison gas, and that 2/3 of all battleships should be destroyed. Although some at the conference were enthusiastic about the proposal, it was more or less dead on arrival. The US Congress would never have approved it, and rising tensions in Europe made such proposals less appealing. Even before Hitler and the Nazis took power, Germany had already begun rearming itself, and after 1933 they did so more explicitly. And by the fall of 1933, Germany had withdrawn from both the conference and the League of Nations. Germany's buildup made France, Czechoslovakia, and Poland refuse to disarm without a guaranteed alliance in the event of a war with Germany, which couldn't be secured at the time. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union was in the midst of its industrialization campaign and was not interested in disarming. This was on top of its paranoia about another international intervention into Soviet territory. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931, and thus was not only hostile towards disarmament, but was also not participating in the conference. And once FDR came into office, he would use shipbuilding jobs for the US Navy as a jobs program in the New Deal. The conference was adjourned in early 1934, with no agreement having been made. The last interwar arms limitation agreement was the Second London Naval Treaty, but by this point, it was a paper tiger. Of the 5 signatories of the First London Treaty, only 3 participated. Due to Japan's refusal to join, they couldn't agree on a ceiling for the number of warships. All it did was limit the maximum size of ships and what caliber of guns they could carry. What ultimately made the treaty a useless piece of paper was a clause that gave the signatories permission to ignore any of the rules set in it if it was necessary for national security, which was a blank check to do whatever you wanted. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. Click the top link in the description to play for free, and don't forget to use the promo code WARSHIPS to get free doubloons and a bunch of other goodies. I'd also like to thank my patrons for making this video possible. Patrons get access to certain benefits, such as getting to see videos early, getting to see ad-free versions of the video, as well as getting access to a patrons-only Discord server. Find out more at patreon.com/casualhistorian. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.